Today I'm speaking with Tai Goodwin. Tai, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, it's such a pleasure to speak with you. And just for a quick context before I give the bio, your brother is Brady Goodwin of the Ichabod podcast. Brady's been an awesome friend and kind of a colleague. So I
Mhm.
do want to plug Brady's channel too. So go check him out. Check out Ichabod on YouTube. But in terms of Ty's bio, I wanted to just mention that she's from Philadelphia, which I am from too. Where part of Philly are you from?
I grew up all over South Philly, Alney, West of
Okay.
Lane. Yeah.
Nice. I'm from right near the airport, so not too far from that at all. And but now she lives in Orlando, which is cool. And Ty is a vision midwife and liberation coach. She is renowned for empowering high achieving women, leaders, and entrepreneurs to expand their visions and break free from constraints. She's the founder of the Good Wealth Group, and she specializes in transformative one-on-one coaching, targeted group programs, and exclusive retreats. She's an accomplished author and host of the Girl Get Free podcast. She shares inspiring stories of transformation, and her innovative coaching methods have made her a catalyst for change, guiding clients to achieve professional success and to lead fulfilling, liberated lives. And that's what I know about you so far, but I know there's a lot more we're going to talk about. But before we get into your story, just tell us more about yourself. We love to get to know people.
One of the things about me as I am a book hoarder and a board game lover. And by book hoarder, I mean like I literally have like 10 to 12 boxes of books that I've collected over the years. And books have always been my safe place and my fun thing. So
That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, I'm the same way. It'd be nice to have a big library. Well, we're here, of course, to hear your story. We love to invite people, if you could, to take us back to the earliest days. Like, what did you, if you remember, like the very earliest memories, what was the first time you remember hearing about the Bible or God? What were those stories like, and how did your faith journey evolve from there?
it's my family is full of Baptist people, you know. So I have very early memories. Like one of my earliest memories is probably not a, well, it's a fun memory. I remember being like 3 or 4 years old and being spanked in the church because, I was there with my aunt and I was crawling over the seat. I was a kid. I was like, 3 or 4 years old and I'm crawling and she kept telling me to stop. And I wouldn't stop. And I literally remember her taking me down to the basement where they had Sunday school and spanking me so I could get back into service with her and be like the docile child. So those are my earliest memories of, you
Hmm.
know, being in church services over and over again. My mother played piano, my grandmother, Sunday school evangelist, my aunt was a Sunday school teacher. So our life revolved around church. And so I grew up with always knowing about church. I grew up with vacation Bible school, and learning, all the songs, Yes, Jesus Loves You. And I grew up with that, from the very, very foundation. And in the beginning, it was just what we did, you know. I laugh now when I think about seeing kids grow up and they have like dance parties like at their house on like a Friday night or, when a family gets together and they dance at a barbecue. Like we had like choir. Like we'd be up in a room like listening to Andre Crouch songs and everybody had their part that they would sing with Andre Crouch. And I mean, like we would literally have like jam sessions, like gospel jam sessions for like hours and hours on like a Friday night. And, with my mom, my cousins, my aunts, and that's what I grew up with. My grandmother, very old school. So she was Jimmy Swaggart and what's the guy
Wow.
name? Jim Baker, Reverend Shambach.
Oh
I'm
no.
talking like tent meetings. Like I remember going to tent meetings where these, big tents outside where you go in and they're having Holy Ghost night, and then there's people screaming and singing and running around, and me being deathly afraid of all the stuff that was happening. And I also grew up under the time of Billy Graham crusades. So we're trekking to see Billy Graham in stadiums with thousands of people. And yeah, so that was what I grew up with. And so by the time I was 7, it was already entrenched in me, but I had not like done the deed, right? Hadn't done the deed yet. I just was going to Bible, vacation Bible school, Sunday school, saying the verses, singing the songs, doing all the things that we did as a family. But my aunt, my favorite person in the whole world was my aunt Margie. And she, at the time, she was the only aunt. My mom has 5 sisters, and she was the only aunt at the time that didn't have kids. but she had taken like me and my older cousin, and she was just such a role model. She would take us to the beach. She would take us to all these places. She would teach us. She taught us all, like all the cousins in our family. She taught every single one of us how to tie our shoe. Like she was that amazing of a person. And I love spending time with her. And she was a Christian. And so I remember I wanted to be a Christian because my aunt Margie was a Christian. She just embodied like this joy and this love, and she was a great person. And she was so warm, and she hugged us, and we all loved her. And that's what it was for me. I wanted that. Like I wanted to be like her.
Mm.
So I remember I was about 6 or 7 years old, and nobody was in the room with me. I remember my mom was like in the kitchen making lunch somewhere. But guess what was on TV? I think it was either Jim Baker. I'm pretty sure it was Jim Baker and a PTL. Remember that Praise the Lord Club? And and at the time, this was way before his scandal and way before all that stuff was public knowledge. And I remember sitting there on the floor, and then he says, "Okay, if you want to be saved, put your hand on the screen and say the prayer." And I put my hand on the screen and I said the prayer, and I ran and told my mom. I was so excited. But nobody made me do it. There was no force. It was something that I genuinely wanted because of what I saw in my eye.
Mm.
And, I was 7. So did I know the full extent of it? No. But I knew that I wanted to be like my Aunt Margie. And I was like excited because I kind of sealed the deal.
I mean, were your parents Christians as well?
My mom was, my dad was not. My dad was a big drinker back then, and it caused a lot of contention. Um, in our house, kind of growing up in that space. But my mom was very much like, I mean, like Christian, how can I say it? Christian with all the with all the trimmings. I guess I'll say it that way. Like you go to church on Sunday, you do this, we don't curse, we don't do this. Like I remember my dad hiding his Shaka Khan album. So for those of you who don't know, like you look at Shaka Khan now, you feel like, oh, Shaka Khan, she's just this. No, Shaka Khan, like back in the day, she was like the Janelle Monáe. Right. She was wearing the bell bottoms and the cleavage showing, and my dad had actually hidden his Shaka Khan album from my mom because my mom was like, it's worldly music, it's secular music, we don't listen to that in our house. And so, like I said, she was like a Christian with all the trimmings.
Mm. No, when you did present it to your mom, was she, I assume, excited for you at that point? Or did she
I,
think you were already saved?
I don't remember her exact response, but it would have been like normal because, like I said, that's what we did. We sang, we went to church, we went to vacation Bible school. I remember my grandmother, who was a very interesting person. I mean, just like, from when I knew her, she was like the holy religious, like I'm talking like at Thanksgiving, like we're like, can you please stop praying so we can eat the food? Kind of, every prayer was the blood of Jesus. And that, I mean, every single prayer was like that. And so that's how she was. But I remember her also teaching me the 23rd Psalm. Right. So she taught me that and made me memorize it. But was one of my most frightening memories of her is being like 6 or 7 and being really young. And I would hear her screaming in the other room, "Get behind me, Satan, get behind me, Satan," like in her prayer. Right.
Wow.
So and she was also the Billy Graham and the Jimmy Swagger, and she would put her little music on and do her stumps. And so when I say like my family was entrenched in this was normal. This is just what we did and how we were. And it never crossed my mind that there was anything wrong with it. It was good. That's what we do.
Mm. Yeah, we were very similar. I have a lot of similarities there, of course, not just the being around Philadelphia, but our big thing was my dad would constantly play Christian radio. And I didn't know at the time, but it was like old time preachers a lot of the time, where it was
Uh-huh.
like some of them were alive, but there were several that had been like either they were dead or they were one foot in the grave at that point. But it was like they'd been preaching for 50 years, and somebody somewhere had been like, we got to catalog this stuff and put it on the radio, and they just would just play it on
Yeah.
a cycle. But we were always doing similar things where it was the God message has to be kind of like constant. And it reminded me when I learned about how the Jewish people would often take literally this idea of like wrap it around your wrists and put it on your head.
Mhm.
It's like the word of God has to be constantly at the forefront of your thinking. And it sounds like with your family and certainly with mine too, like they took that literally in the sense of like we got to get the preaching. It's not just Sunday, it's every day.
Mhm.
It's all over the place. Like you can't miss this. God's love and the gospel and your need for salvation is just plastered all over the place.
Well, I have a different reason that I think that we grew up that way, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But I think it stems from trying to soothe. I think it was kind of like an addiction. It's like people, yeah, and what we could definitely talk about that. But it was very when I look back on that time, it was very odd that there was so much coming from outside in terms of the Bible, the movies. I mean, I don't know if you're old enough to remember this, but my grandmother used to have these little tracks. Remember those little tracks? And I was fascinated by them because they were cartoons and they looked like they were like good stories, but they were so bad because it was like there was one that was like burning hell or something like that. And it was
Yeah,
like the
the
little
chick
guy.
tracks.
And yes. And it was just like, you're gonna go to hell, da, 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 and the devil. And it was just like, but that's what was all around our house. And my grandmother had stacks and stacks of those because she would be passing them out. And so when you're indoctrinated like that, right, you think that it's normal. But what I was gonna say is as much as all that stuff we were taking in, we hardly ever talked. So there wasn't the conversations about like, what did you do today? What do you feel? What do you think? It was Jesus, Jesus, Jesus all the time. The blood of Jesus. You love Jesus. Tell me a Bible verse. And I
Hmm.
realized how imbalanced that was. And it meant that I never really got to know the people that I was living in a house with, the people that were in my family, because everything was filtered through I'm Christian and this is who I am. And that's the only thing I've ever been in my entire life.
Hmm. That's fascinating. It's sad. It's crazy, but I can relate to that. I definitely see where you're going with that. And I
Yeah.
think just one other thing too I would add for my side was that I think there was a strong protection measure of like we need to be separate from the world. So
Mhm.
while you in your heads, kids, that all the other neighborhood kids are watching all kinds of garbage on TV, that's not us. We are different and we're intentionally different. And we're going to stay with this barrier, this shield, as it were, to make sure that we're focused on holiness. And we don't
Mhm.
want to be like the world. And so you mix all this stuff up, but yeah, I get it.
Yeah.
It is weird. And especially I think when you deconvert, which I know I'm jumping ahead in that comment, but when you deconvert, you really realize you never really knew these people because they never really lived a day in their lives for real. They always were like, who am I in light of God? And who am I in light of the Bible and the church, as opposed to just who am I? And it's crazy to think about.
Well, what's interesting is that my grandmother was not that always that way though. Like I've heard rumor that at one point she was like running a speakeasy, right? And, I know for a fact that there's like five, six girls and like a couple of different fathers of the kids. So she had this total life before she became the evangelist, Florence Ballard. She had this total life, that we don't really know anything, about who she is. And for us, it didn't feel like protection. It was never under the guise of protection. It was always under the guise of you don't want to go to hell. You don't want to sin. You don't want to be outside of God's will. You don't want to get God's judgment. My mom used to tell a story, and when I was younger, about cousin Mary. And the story was that cousin Mary had a son who was in the war, and she prayed to God, "Oh, please bring my son home, and I will serve you." And God brought her son home. She didn't do what she promised to do, and so God caused her to lose her sight.
Wow.
Right? So, like, it was always punitive. It was always, you're going to go to hell. It was always the devil's after you. And so it wasn't about protection, about holiness. It was very much about fear. And so I learned that fear. And it's very interesting because when I signed up, right, it had nothing to do with fear. I wanted to be like my Aunt Margie. But as I attended church, which I did a lot of church, it and really listened to what was being said and um, how things were presented to us, it became very clear that, oh, you will go to hell, you will burn forever. They used to vacation Bible school. And at this point, maybe I was like, I don't know, maybe like 9, 10 years old. But I remember the movies they showed us, like A Thief in the Night. I don't know if you've ever seen those movies.
Yeah.
And that's they're just seen as either a Thief in the Night. There's one other one that was kind of like they were paired together. But there's a scene at the end of that movie where there's a little girl holding a balloon, but because her family didn't accept Christ, but they also didn't take the mark of the beast, which was a big thing, like the 666 on your forehead or something like that. Um, they were going to be killed because they didn't do this. And at the end of the scene, the little girl was holding a balloon, and you hear a guillotine, and you see the red balloon floating up in the air. That haunted, like it's still to this day, one of those memories that just is stuck in my brain because that's what it's that fear, right? You have to believe and you don't want to take the mark of the beast and you don't want to do this because if you do, you'll either go to hell or you'll be killed.
Mm.
And it's heavy for a 7, 8, 9, 10, 20 year old. Like it's heavy no matter what age you are, but especially, when you're that age.
Yeah, that is so intense. And I definitely have some of those memories too. It's crazy. I've got a memory of one where the guy was in a car accident and all of his friends in the car were Christians, so they got raptured, but he's just kind of like sitting in this car wreck and he's, basically on the way to the judgment seat to be judged for his actions now that he's dead. And I can still
Mhm.
see it in my head, that image. Yeah, it's crazy. It's interesting too, the idea that you mentioned of the aunt that got blindness. There
Mhm.
was definitely in my, I don't know if my parents would have quite said it this way, but as I reflect on it, I feel like this is true. There's a really strong message of like, God wants to bless you, but if you disobey, he will definitely curse you. And that's clear, of course, in a lot of passages in the Old Testament. If you obey me, I'll bless you. If you disobey, I'll curse you. And then you get into the New Testament. Don't be deceived. God cannot be mocked. Whatever a man sows, that will he reap. And so you
Mhm.
get this sense that like God is begging to bless you, but he also will let you do your own thing. He'll let you ruin your life. He'll let you shipwreck yourself. If you really are intent on it, he'll let you die. And so it was always this sense of like, our family's better than this, but you have to stay close. And they would often, in terms of alcoholism, it wasn't necessarily related to religion, but they would talk about how like I had a great grandfather or great great grandfather who was like a mean drunk. He'd get drunk
Mhm.
and then he'd beat the shit out of his wife. And but from that generation on, our family was like, we don't touch alcohol. Like our family is a non-alcoholic, teetotaling family because you don't want to go near that. That was a horrible memory for our family origin. And it's kind of like a similar spiritual sense. Like our family has the chance to truly be something special for the Lord, but you have to stay on the straight and narrow. And so the rules were there. The gospel was constantly being preached. And, in some ways it did work. I mean, hell, it took me 43 years to get out. It worked pretty well.
Yeah, it's interesting the things that we do because we want to be better. Like I think, and a lot of it, and I don't have any, like I've got, more stories to share, of course. And I don't share any of these stories from a place of judgment. I really do believe that the people that were in our families or in our families, they did the best that they could with what they knew. And so I'm able to step back and look at it and say, yeah, a lot of this stuff was really shitty. Doesn't mean that they were shitty people, but they just didn't know. They didn't have the knowledge, they didn't have the skill, they didn't have the healing, they didn't have the opportunity. And so they did the best that they could with what they knew and what they had. And I do think a lot of it, in some ways it was under the intention of I want to be better, I want to be right, I want to be good. But because it isn't a real solution, and I know we'll talk about that later, it just what it ends up doing is it ends up masking a lot of things. And so the people never get healed. And so what we end up seeing, and when I look back on it, what I end up seeing is a lot of people who probably had some emotional and mental health issues. And this is what I mean by like that when they're playing the stuff all the time because they're trying to squash the stuff that's trying to come through, and they think that if I just pray enough, and if I just believe, and if I just say enough Bible verses, right? Because that's what, as I got into my teens, that's what it became. If I just go to church enough, if I just say enough Bible verses, if I just learn enough Bible verses, then I'll be able to be good, and I will be able to stop this doing the stuff that I'm not supposed to do. God will protect me, God will fix me. I won't go to hell if I can just stay on this path, if I can just do all the things. And so, went through middle school, and I was a pretty good kid in middle school, except I was cutting school a lot because I didn't want to go to school. But went through middle school. I remember writing Jesus, I love Jesus on my notebook, and then covering it up because people were going to tease me about it. But I mean, I was like, that's how I was. Like I was youth, going to youth ministry at church. Like I was saved. I was in it. Now, I will also say that one of the things that happens is you start to doubt, right? Because what they tell you is, well, if you're saved, you don't do this. So I'm saved, but I did something. I'm saved, but I did this. I'm saved, but I danced. I'm saved, but this. Oh, does that mean I need to go up to the altar again? And so I did find myself in that pattern. I'm sure a lot of your audience can relate to this was, whenever you go to church and they have this altar call and they're saying, did you backslide this week? Did you do X, Y, and Z? And so I've been up to that altar several times, wanting to quote unquote confess my sins and get Jesus back in me, or, get Jesus to forgive me. But it becomes like the thing that you do because you really, 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 really want to be saved. So I'm going to go up here as many times as possible. I'm going to let them lay hands on me. I'm going to go praise dance. I'm going to worship. I'm going to shout. I'm going to do all the things. I'm going to learn to speak in tongues. And you do all of these things. And that's what I did,
Mm,
from not just the Bible study, but now we're going on to being part of the youth choirs and, being part of the different ministries. And then we're doing praise dance. And I mean, that was high school, right? I was doing all of those things. But I was still having some really bad times, because of some of the things that had went on in my home and
mm,
some of the things that I never know. So we didn't talk, right? Nobody ever really talked to us. Um, didn't know how to handle, didn't know how to deal with things, didn't know how to didn't know how to become, didn't know how to express any of the things that I was dealing with and I was going through and who I really was. By the time
mm.
I got into college, I went to one party. So Philadelphia because you're from there, but I went to Drexel University, which is in the inner city. So it's not like I went to some suburban place. So I went to Drexel University, and I was there for 5 years, and it's not because I was slow. Drexel has a co-op program, so their programs take a little bit long because you're working half the time while you're there. And I also changed majors a few times. But I went to one party the entire time, 5 years. Drexel is like a lot of stuff going on. But guess what I was doing, Tim? Here's what my schedule was. Sunday morning was church. Sunday afternoon was second service. Monday, I think we had off. Tuesday was either worship, like worship practice. Wednesday was Bible study. No, Tuesday was prayer meeting. Wednesday was Bible study. Thursday was, ready for this? Thursday was the gospel choir for Drexel. And then, as soon as gospel choir was from 7 to 9, and then we would go to the white Christian fellowship from 9 to whenever. And
Wait,
I
what is
led
it? What is it
worship,
called?
Drexel Christian Fellowship. And
Okay.
at the time it was, and I say it was the white one because there was a black one that I went to on Friday. So Thursday was gospel choir for 2 hours, then Drexel Christian Fellowship, where at some point I was being a worship leader for that. And then on Friday, it was the Black Christian Fellowship called Disciples Indeed. I was on the leadership team for that at some point. And then Saturday it was choir. I wasn't on the choir, I was on the worship team rehearsal, right? And anything else that was going on in church. I did it for 5 years,
Mm,
5 years
wow.
in college.
All for free.
Yeah, yeah. But I was in it. I was leading Bible study. I was discipling other people. Had little disciple books and brought people in. And I was such a zealot and just, oh yeah, we gotta, gotta be telling people about Jesus, and you need to come to church, and you need to come to Bible study. That's what I did.
Mm. I was very busy too. I don't think I was quite that busy. That's pretty intense. I do look back at it and I do wonder sometimes, even though I do see it all as mythology now, and in that sense, it's a loss, a true loss. But I wonder at times if I would have gotten in trouble if I didn't have some of that. And so in some ways, it's like, well, you always have to look back and say, what can I take that's good from this? What can I, say there's still something, this wasn't all a bad thing. Certainly,
Mhm.
like you said, our parents were just trying to do their best with what they knew at the time. There wasn't even
Yeah.
an internet back then, so they couldn't have researched stuff. But like, what else was good? I wonder if I would have gotten in trouble if I wasn't in church so
Mhm.
much and doing mission stuff. And who
Yeah.
knows?
Well, yeah, I thought about that, and I think it was for me because I didn't know how to be,
Yeah,
and so I don't, I don't look back on it like, oh my gosh, it made me a bad person or anything like that. But it just, when I think back about it, I do wish that I had explored more. But what I realize now is that Christianity and the church doesn't allow you to explore and become anything. So you don't know,
yeah,
and I have a daughter now, and when I was terrified when I had her because I'm like, I don't know how to be a mom, I don't know how to be a parent. That's gonna be horrible. But she's amazing. But one of the things that I did when she was younger was I was very adamant about not using fear to raise her. Because I never wanted her to only do something because I was there with a whip or with a belt or with, like, I'm gonna beat you, so you're gonna do X, Y, and Z. Right. I didn't want that for her because what I realized, and this is what we see in Christianity, is that the minute you put somebody in a different context where you don't have the punishment, they're going to do whatever the hell they want because they have not learned to make better decisions. And I think that at the end, what Christianity takes away from you is learning how to make really good decisions, because everything comes back to, well, am I going to go to hell? And let me be real honest. A lot of times it's not even, am I going to go to hell at some point? Because I think we, at some point, we realize, even if we don't acknowledge it, that that's not like the thing that's making us make the decision. It's, am I going to be found out? Can I
yeah,
do X, Y, and Z without getting found out? Who's going to know if I do X, Y, and Z? But we're constantly making our decisions around that instead of, hey, is this something that I'm really interested in? Or is this something that I really want to explore? How do I really feel about that? So I feel like it strips you of having that experience of becoming a real person,
yeah.
right?
And especially when you get that in depth and committed as you were, you often get invited to be part of leadership and on stage or what have you. And when you get to that level where you're either in official leadership or at least in a somewhat of a leadership role, you do
Mm-hmm.
end up really feeling that facade dynamic come into play where you're like, I can't let people know how much I'm struggling. I at least have to, if I say it, I have to be like using it as a way of being humble. Like, I'm struggling just like you all are doing, but you know what? Grace of God's getting me through this. And even if it's like, just you're just doing it to keep the service going. You're like, I've got to keep the message going. This is a machine, and the machine has to keep going from there's a problem, I struggle, I sin, to God is the solution. He's the one that fixes stuff. And if I diverge from that to, well, he's kind of the solution, but it doesn't feel like it. And he does give joy, but I don't really have it. And I haven't had it for a year or two. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, when you start, if you admit there's cracks that are much more foundational, it starts to fall apart. So, and you just can't go there. And certainly with the idea of like a sexual sin, not necessarily that in terms of real life, but just in your mind of like,
Mm-hmm.
if a pastor or a worship leader is struggling with their thought life, they really can't go there because then you're going to feel like you're disqualified in some way, whether you've actually done something in real life or just in your head. But can I ask, just going back for 1 second, you
Yeah.
mentioned the white fellowship and the black fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
What That's a really interesting dynamic, and I can tell some stories myself, but I want to hear yours. What was it like in terms of just the racial implied segregation of like, why, if the
Mm-hmm.
Bible even says there's neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, we're all one in Christ, and yet Sunday morning is one of the most
Yeah.
racially segregated days of the, maybe arguably the most segregated day of the week in America and perhaps in the whole world. Like, what was it like growing up thinking there's white churches, but why are there almost no black people there? And there's black churches, why are there almost no white people there? Why aren't
Mm-hmm.
we like in a mixed congregation? Where are the mixed congregations?
I was just this funny because I was just listening to that quote the other day. I think it's Malcolm X that said that, 12 o'clock is the most the most segregated time in the country because of the black and the white churches. I know on the aesthetic side of it, it was the music and the way things were presented, right? Like the music, the worship music that we sang in a white Christian fellowship was completely different. It was also funded by InterVarsity. And though InterVarsity, they're still, big on, college campuses across the world, and their whole goal is to make disciples and missionaries and all that kind of stuff. But it was funded from that perspective. And so they had a very different curriculum and pattern. They had a person, I think her name, well, I remember her name was Barb Weidman, who was the adult, right? Who was the person that was installed on that campus to build up the ministry. On the other hand, the Drexel, the Disciples Indeed, the Black Bible study was simply run by Black students. We didn't have somebody who was a paid person that was there to lead us and guide us. It was just Black students wanted to come together and have Bible study on their own. And that was it. And yeah, we had like our praise time, we had our prayer, we had all those different things. And when you grow up in a predominantly Black church, it's not a Pentecost, it's not a Presbyterian church, right? It's not an Episcopalian church. It's very, very different. And a lot of the things that you would say or do in a Black church or service, you would never do that in that kind of church. Now, I've always been kind of in a mix because even though and you'll laugh at this, I went to Masterman in Philadelphia. And at the time, Masterman is a public school, right? So I say that because I know Tim knows the area, but Masterman was a public school, and at one time was the number one public school in the country. But you had to either take a test or get invited in to the school. They only let people in from fifth grade to like fifth grade to seventh grade. And when I went to the high school, even though they had like 300 kids in the ninth grade, you had to apply to stay for high school. I
Mm.
applied to stay for high school, and there was only one class. There was one 10th grade class, one 11th grade class, one 12th grade class. I graduated from a class of 27 in a Philadelphia public high school. I was the only Black girl in my class of 27. So
Wow.
I didn't even though I lived in the neighborhood, even though I lived like in the hood, I lived in Albany, I lived across the street from drug dealers, and I had a neighbor who would, I would literally watch her walk to prostitute herself with her son, like pimping her. Like I literally would watch that like from my door.
Mm.
But I was going in the city to this school. So I didn't grow up in a neighborhood high school. I had very, very different interaction. So I had no problem going to the white Christian fellowship. But a lot of the people that were in that Bible study on Friday, they did not go. And so they would try to make these things where they would have these like events where they would do things together and, but it was very, very segregated. And I know a lot of it was because of the music, the way we talk, the way we interact. Now, when I think about it, it was just we wanted to be around people who we are like.
Yeah.
We wanted to be in a place where we felt safe. We wanted to be in a place where we weren't going to be asked to compromise or change.
Yeah.
And
Exactly.
so that's what we got. We had those two things, and then we had gospel choir as well. And the Drexel Gospel Choir was huge. It's still huge. They have like 25 and 30-year anniversaries, all those kind of things. But I could count on like one hand the number of people that were not Black on Drexel's gospel choir.
Mm. It's
Yeah.
amazing. If I can just add a quick anecdote of something that was fascinating to me, when I was at Lancaster Bible College, which is why I went to Bob Jones for a year, but then finished up the rest of my undergrad at LBC, where
Hmm.
I know Brady went to.
Uh-huh.
But they, I was in the pastoral program, and at the end of it, we had to do this, some different things than we were expecting. But one of them was this pastoral program towards the very end of our time was you had to spend this semester not going to your church on Sunday mornings, but going to other churches. Like you kind of had to tell your church, you won't see me for 3 months or whatever, 4 months. And so you'd spend your Sunday mornings going to a bunch of other churches just purely for the exposure of it. And I remember at one point, the man that was leading it, that pastoral program, he said, this upcoming Sunday, we're actually all going to go to one particular church. It's the biggest Black church in Philadelphia. And I forget what the name of it was. But I mean, that was an experience. I'd never been in a Black church a day in my life.
Hmm.
And one of the most interesting things was there were nurses all
Hmm.
over. And I was like, why are there nurses here? And it was like they number one, of course, Black people are classy dressers. I mean, they know how to dress to the nines. So you got everybody in their suits and their dresses and their hats. but that
Mhm.
makes the more you're putting on your suit jackets, everything, you're hot. It's a packed to the packed congregation, packed building. Everyone's dressed and it's really hot. The ceiling fans can't go fast enough. And so people are literally like in danger of passing out. And
Wow.
especially because like for us, our worship services would tend to be like maybe an hour. And if the pastor was brave enough to push it, an hour and a quarter. Whereas like in this church, it was like you're there for 4 hours.
Oh yeah.
And it's like that's intense. And you might literally pass out. So that was
Hmm.
really a fascinating thing. But then I got very involved later with some missions in Chester. Do you know where Chester is?
Yeah.
Chester's
Hmm.
a very a poor area near Philadelphia. I was working with a black pastor there for quite a while, doing work in Chester High and other things, just tutoring kids. And but I went to his church a few times, and it was like this little micro church. It was like again a black church, but like real. It was like basically in somebody's house. They
Yeah.
just ripped out everything and just turned it into a church. But that was interesting too. But it was very similar where I was like, there's no white people here, and it always felt to me like this is such a tragedy. Like, what a great chance for us to show the world that God really does break down the barriers. And
Hmm.
the thing that I never heard about till I started doing these interviews for the channel. But I remember too when the first time I heard somebody say, a black person say, not only did they recognize that issue, but that when they ever saw a picture of Jesus, it was a white man. What was
Hmm.
that like for you? Did you have that experience too?
Well, we don't know any better. So we believe, okay, that's who Jesus is. And it's funny. I'm dating a guy who's Venezuelan, so he's not from this country. And we were talking about schools and how we grew up with schools. And I was explaining to him like how systematic like racism can be. And I said, when we went to school, every single book was Sam and Ann with blonde hair and blue eyes. We never saw any Black characters in a book that are teaching us how to read and how to think.
Hmm.
So when you think about that, it's like, oh, but it's just a book and I'm here to learn how to read. I said, no, no, no. What it's doing is preparing you. This is the world that you live in. You are not in this world. And it's the same thing with church, right? Jesus is white. The disciples are all white. This is the world. And so you don't see yourself. And we never question it. Just like we didn't question the books that we had in school, we never question it in church either. And we'll get to this, but one of the places where I got to be was, what if how do we have a spirituality that takes that filter away? Where my filter is not centered on a white Jesus
Yeah.
or a white gospel, because it really, really is. And it's really when you think about how deep it gets, and we can talk about that because I've got some thoughts about that too. But when you get to really see how deep it is, it's really quite disturbing.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And
Mhm.
it makes you realize too that there's even despite our best intentions, and I say us meaning people from my background, and white people that was my church was a white church, but like despite our best intentions, we were part of racism and colonialism, and there's got to be some admission to it, even if we didn't mean it, we didn't
Yeah.
think about it that way. I mean, I truly like I never thought a day of my life, and I one of my best friends growing up was I mean literally for like 15-20 years, one of my best friends was a black woman. She was
Mhm.
wonderful. We talk every week, and I loved her friendship. And she was just, racism wasn't a big thing for me. But when you step back from it, despite some of those one-on-one friendships, the system has racism embedded in it, and you're kind of trained to not see it, at least from
Yeah.
my vantage point.
Oh, yeah. Oh, and when you think about the churches that have been predominantly white, I'm always blown away by how they will say how they said, we're very Jesus based and we want to help people, we want to heal people, but where did you make the effort? Like what did you ever do to reach out or to show up? And I'm gonna be real honest, what did you ever do except say that maybe you were going to donate food? As if the only way for you to ever connect with Black people was to help them with their poverty. Like, get the
Yeah,
fuck out of here. That's not the only way for you to connect with people. Like, you have to give us charity. When did you ever build a real bridge that was based on, oh, you're human, I'm human, you're Christian, we're Christian, we should be doing something together? Where was that ever part of your mission and part of your value system? And it just hasn't been there.
yeah, Yeah, it's very true. Can I
Mhm.
ask just I know we're diverging a little bit from your particular story in the sense of the actual timeline, but just to kind of wrap up
Yeah.
some of these questions, what was your experience like for anyone that left the Black church either because they were maybe I want to use a couple quick things that come to mind. Either they're sinning, like they're sleeping around and they know that
Mhm.
the pastor knows and this person knows, and they're kind of looking down, shame on you for being sexually immoral. So they just stop coming, or they just want to maybe work, like they're working 7 days a week and like, sorry, I'm not coming to church. I got to work all the time. Or horror of horror is the worst one. I'm not coming because I just don't think this is the truth anymore. I don't believe in Jesus or God. What kind of typical ostracization would you see, or was it more like, we're just going to love you back to the church, or was it more like, look, you got a little leash to go a little further, but if you go much further, we're gonna pretty much deliver you over to Satan, to let Satan have his way with you, so know how bad this is going to get.
Well, the first that I had was that when people were involved in sexual sin, they didn't leave the church. What are you talking about? They go to church every week.
Okay.
So, you've got pastors that are sleeping with people in the church, so they're not leaving.
Hmm.
We had a lot of teen mothers or people that were pregnant out of wedlock. Now, I do know of, some churches, somewhere where they say they were sat down, or, they were made to sit in the back pew, or they weren't able to hold any positions in church because they were doing X, Y, and Z. And so you do hear about that, and we do know that those kinds of things happen. But for the most part, it's par for the course, even to the point where you knew that there were people that were in the worship team or that were singing in a choir that were homosexuals. You knew. And some people, now that was some things where people might have left, or they got, maybe put out, or they, you can't be on the choir anymore or anything like that. So, that was that we saw those things happening. But there wasn't this like, oh, you're doing X, Y, and Z. So we're gonna ask you to, we're gonna kick you out of the church.
Hmm.
I didn't see a lot of that. But
That's
what I
very
did,
different from ours was like, you step out of
Mhm,
line, you are
mhm,
absolutely
yeah.
under church discipline and you're cut off.
Yeah. Yeah. Now there are some churches that are like that. If you're in an apostolic faith, or, they're very Kojic churches, there are some churches that are very much like that. But like I said, there were things that people knew were happening and knew were going on. And you kind of swept it under the rug, or you just kind of didn't talk about it, other than somebody being, like I said, sat down, or you can't lead in ministry because you're pregnant, but then you have the big crying sessions where, oh Lord, I'm so sorry. And, then God forgives you. And then all the mothers, I mean, so it's, you kind of know how to work the system at some point, because if you just pray enough and cry enough and act like God is really dealing with you and you're remorseful, people probably forget about it and you just go on with your life.
Yeah, it's true. It sounds like there were more opportunities for women to be in leadership in those churches as well. Is that right? To be preachers of some kind?
Well, you have to, because there's not a lot of Black men in church.
Okay.
It's not, there's, the numbers, and I don't have the actual statistics, but that's been something that's known for years. The number of Black women in church heavily outweighs the number of Black men, in church. And so, it's interesting, because what that means is the men that are there are seen as prizes, right? The men, and become the pastor and become the deacon, and this and that. But of course, you have to have women in some roles. Now, they're not going to be able to preach every Sunday. They're not going to have the same accolades and the same prestige, right, as the first lady or the deacon mother and all that. They're not going to have that. But you would expect to have more women in leadership, simply because the men are not always there.
Yeah. Hmm. It's an interesting dynamic. I hadn't
Mhm.
put those pieces together that way, but that makes sense. Now, just a couple final questions on the church issue. Were you part of the sort of background where they would do what's called name it and claim it, or the prosperity gospel? Like I'm here in
Yeah.
Atlanta now. I don't live in Philly anymore. I'm just north of Atlanta. I'm not far from a church run by a guy named Creflo Dollar, if you're familiar with that name.
Yeah.
I could almost throw a stone and hit his church.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
but that background of like if you're good with God, God's gonna take good care of you. You're gonna be showing up eventually in a Lexus. You're gonna have the
Mhm.
nice Rolex. And was that part of it, or was it more like, was poverty and wealth not seen as a necessarily a sign of God's blessing?
When by the time I'd gotten into high school, we were at a different church. We were not in a Baptist church anymore. And so we're in a non-denominational church, and it wasn't the hardcore name it and claim it, but it was very prosperity based. It was very much give your tithes and God will return your, do your 10% so God will bless you, and he'll make your cup runneth over. And we're quoting all the scriptures about if God be for you, who could be against you, and all the things about his enemy, he's gonna cause your enemies to fall at your feet. I mean, there's all those things that were promised to you if you are covered under his blood and you're under his protection and you're doing all these things. Then you could expect that God will bless you or you'll be prosperous. Is that, that song, Beloved, we wish above all things that you prosper and be in good health, even as your soul prospers. Singing that song every Sunday, right? So we had all the makings that, but there was not this name it and claim it. Like Creflo Dollar's on the extreme of that bullshit. And there's a whole bunch of people who were in that phase. And we kind of actually look down our nose at that because God isn't a genie, right? He's not, your miracle maker and all that kind of stuff. But you should expect that if you're doing all the things that you're paying your tithes, that God is going to press down, shaking together, doubled over. Like, those are the prayers that we pray when we give our tithes and offering, right? That you can expect to be blessed and you should expect to be blessed. And at the very least, you should be sowing into this because you expect your pastor and the church to be blessed. Right. So yes, the pastor should have the car and we should take care of our pastors and then we should have our church building fund, which I mean, for God's sake, learn how to get a business loan and build your church. Like it was, like when I think about it now, just like you don't know how to get business credit, you don't know how to get credit for your building. And so you tax the people in your church and you've got this building fund that's been going on for years, and you're just always telling people to give so you can get another building, so you can have more people. Like you're not even able to help the people that are in your current building. You got people in your current building that are struggling and homeless and gas being shut off and cars being repossessed, but you still want people to pay you to get your building fund so you can get a bigger building so you can serve more people. So it just doesn't add up. But that we weren't the name it and claim it, but we were very prosperity, abundance, health, and wellness coming from God because you were blessed and chosen, and you tithed and paid your offerings.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what was that phrase, blessed and highly favored or something like that, that the Virgin
Yeah.
Mary used. And I think, yeah, some churches would grab that one.
Oh,
It's a crazy, crazy thing. We didn't have too much of the prosperity gospel at all in my circles. It was
mhm.
also looked down on. The one time I remember it kind of came in a little bit was there was a guy who wrote a book called The Prayer of Jabez. Have you heard of that book?
I remember that. Yeah.
And that was a big deal. Like, God does want to expand your borders. And it was probably more spiritualized in my circles, but yeah. Well, going back to
Mhm.
your story, I did want to ask as we kind of get back on your timeline, you mentioned that there was always this question of like, are you spiritual enough? Are you fighting sin
Am I
enough? Are you in the
saved?
word enough to be like saved and secure? Did you
Yeah.
ever get to that point where you just felt like yeah, I'm good. I'm at a kind of like this. It almost feels at times like the spiritual life is like you're graduating to certain levels and tiers of maturity. Did it ever get to a point where you were like, and I'm talking pre deconversion here, of course, but did it ever get to a point where you could kind of really rest and just feel like
Yeah.
I'm good. I've renounced enough sin. I love the Lord enough. We're good.
Not until I threw away all my Bibles.
Hmm. Why would you do that?
Well, this is when things started to click for me, right? I that one of the last church that I was in as a full-blown member and worship like leader for whatever, gospel, whatever thing I was a part of their singles ministry, leading their singles ministry. Um, I got tired of not having prayers answered. I was dealing with some deep stuff. I was dealing with a lot of depression. There had been a lot of abuse in my past, and I was really struggling to understand how to be, how to, with the emotion of it, with a lot of different things going on. Um, and I would be in prayer every Sunday. I'd be, every morning quiet time, the Christian fellowship, all of those things happening, and nothing was changing, no matter
Hmm.
what. And then I noticed that it wasn't just me, right? So typical church, we probably had, went to a small storefront church is what they were called. Um, and we had, probably had around maybe on any given Sunday between maybe 50 or 60 people. Out of that 50 or 60 people, I would say maybe 10 of those people were men, right? To give you some numbers there. And I would watch actually, so this, let me be really clear. 10 of those people were men or boys because the pastor had three sons, and those three sons were all in the band playing the guitar, the drums, and the piano. And they were three of the 10 males that were in that church on
Wow.
Sunday. um, but I got tired, not just of my own, like, hey, I'm praying, I'm fasting, I'm showing up for all these things, and nothing is changing. I'm still miserable. I'm still depressed. I've been having these suicidal tendencies and thoughts and all these things. But I watched all the women in the church every single Sunday. Oh Lord, please bless my husband. My husband's not acting right. Please, help my son. My son is out there drinking and, doing whatever. God, please help me with my job. I lost my car. I need help with my bills. Every single Sunday, the same prayers, the same laying on of hands, the same falling out in the spirit, the same shouting and speaking in tongues every single Sunday. I said, this is ridiculous. Nothing's changing. Nothing's happening. And I was so frustrated. Um, and so disheartened. And I'm like, I don't understand. What I don't, I really I was so clueless because I had made that prayer. And when I made that prayer at 7 or 8, I was so sincere. Like I didn't want anything. I didn't like say I want to become a Christian because I want a car. Like I wanted that connection. And I remember there was this one woman who was like a deaconess, or she was actually the pastor's sister-in-law. And she was doing she was doing one of the sermons. It was like a midnight, I don't know if it was like a New Year's service or something like that. And she had been speaking and she was doing the prayer. So when somebody calls you up for the prayer, everybody, it's like 50 people, right? Everybody gets up to go for prayer, whether you need it or not. So I remember getting up in the prayer line, and this woman, Tim, was literally trying to push me to the floor. Because I'm there with my
Wow.
hands up, and you got the emotions, the dopamine, if you read about the dopamine effect of worship and how it makes you feel. And so everybody's in that energy. But this woman was literally trying to push my neck down and push me back to make it seem like if I had fallen out in the spirit under her holy spiritness or whatever. And I just stood there. I'm like, you're not gonna make me fall to the ground. And I could see the anger in her face because I wasn't stumbling back, and I'm not, because I'm like, I'm tired of acting, right? Like at some point, we're like, yeah, is this a really a spiritual thing, or do I know enough to move my feet and shout? Because that's what we do, and that's what you see everybody else do, right? It's like those studies where they say, like where people have been in a class, and they're the only person that doesn't know this, but everybody else is saying the wrong answer. And then at some point, the person that's not in on it starts to say the wrong answer because everybody else is saying the wrong. It's like that. That's what it felt like. And
Yeah.
that was the day I decided I'm not going back.
Hmm.
I'm done. I'm done with the church. I'm done with that church.
So you weren't
Um,
you weren't pushing away from God. You were just pushing away from churchianity in a
Yeah.
sense. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not going back there. And I thought, and I had been connected to some of those people for at least 3 to 4 years because we all went to college together. So I met these people in college, and a lot of those people that I was in the Black Bible study with, they had this church. It was their church. Like 5 or 6 people from that Black Bible study were in this church. So that's how I got to that church. And I remember when I stopped going to church, they were like, "Oh, you need to come back to church, and God loves you." And da da da. I said, you have not asked me about the stuff that I'm going through. You're not here because of that. You're here because I'm not coming to church. Am I getting this right? And I
Hmm.
said, get it. And I was like, no. And it made me realize that these people really weren't my friends. It wasn't, they didn't really care about me and the things. I was going through some deep stuff. Like and I share this in transparency because I'm hoping it's going to help somebody else. But, when you've been abused and you tend to act out, getting into all kinds of really bad relationships and bad situations, doing those things because you don't know how to do or be any other way. But you're also praying to God to help me, help me, help me. And it's the help isn't coming. And all I can remember, I remember at one point thinking, so I had some stuff happen that really screwed me up with the abuse or whatever. I don't know how to fix this, but I'm going to go to hell because I don't know how to fix this. And I'm praying to God and asking God to help me fix this. And not only am I praying to God, I am memorizing Bible verses. I had the Thompson chain, I had the concordance, I had the studies. I was a big Charles Stanley fan. Like I was like, I'm trying to change. I'm trying to, fix this, God, fix me. I am broken. What's wrong? And nothing's happening. So because I
Mm.
don't know how to, and I remember thinking about this, not just with myself, but I would think about this with other people because at the time, in the community that I was in, it was in Southwest Philadelphia, where the church was. So you know that area, if you were living near the airport, OC, all that. And there's a lot of drugs there. So when you have people, I saw a lot of this, like people like young girls that their parents were, drugged out and they were exposed to a lot of stuff. They didn't know any better, but I'm supposed to believe that God is going to send them to hell for living the way they've only known to live. But God's not intervening to help them. Just you going to a church service is not going to help you. It's not going to fix you. It's not going to fix the cracks and heal the things. Right?
Mm.
And then the other piece that I would see was, and I saw this a lot in my family too, was that we had some really tough stories in our family. Abuse has been pervasive in my family, not just with me, but even with my, aunts, and it's been pervasive in there. And I remember how when my aunts or when a lot of Christian women finally get saved after being like hellish and hoish out in the streets and having kids and having their kids exposed to different things, but now that you're saved, you turn around to your 15, 16, or 17-year-old kid that has watched this dynamic play out, that has been a part of this abuse and even your abuse and your neglect. But now that you're saved, you're going to be mad at them for not being Christian. You're going to be mad at them for not being right with God. But you haven't raised them to be that. Just because you got saved didn't mean you went back and retroactively took back all the shit that your kids saw or experienced. Didn't mean you ever did anything to help them heal. But now that you're saved, you're expecting and demanding them. You got to come to church and you got to be right and you can't do this and you got to do this. And then every Sunday at the altar, God, please fix my child's heart. Please save them, Lord. Help them see they're wayward, that they're not falling in line with you. Help them see that they're sinners and help. No, how about you get them some fucking help? How about you apologize for the horrible shit that you allowed them to see and put them through? How about you start getting some help and heal that and not putting it on an altar and expecting it to magically go away because now you're saved. So I started seeing and putting all that together and I'm like, I don't want this. I don't know how to fix this because I still don't want to go to hell. Right? I don't want to go to hell, but it's not, as we say, the math ain't mathin', right? Like because it's and for me it was because it's generation after generation after generation, right? I'm looking
Mm.
back here and I'm like, and I laugh at this with my brother because like I said, my grandmother was the prayer, she's the prayer warrior, she was the evangelist. And every holiday, every road trip, we got to go to grandma's house so she can pray for us and oil and all that kind of stuff. Like, and I'm thinking, like, for all the stuff that happened, for all the holiness that she was, and I might get in trouble for saying this, but I don't care. Keep this in your show. For all the holiness and all the prayer that she was, my mom has five sisters, so there's six of them. Only one of those six sisters had children in wedlock. Only one man out of all the sisters that have been married, out of all six of them, only one of them is still married. And in all of the cousins, out of all of us cousins, and there's like 11 or 12 of us, because there's like, three years, like 11, 12 of us. Um, I don't think think any of us has had a child inside of wedlock.
Mm.
Every out of 11, like the boys, the girls, none of us. So for out of all of the praying and oil and Jimmy Swagger and tent meetings and casting out the devil, and out of all of that, this is what happened. And you're trying to tell me that that stuff that works? Show me the receipt, show me the proof. Because
Mm.
that's something's weak, something's not right. Because you
Mm.
were, we were holy, we were church, we were sanctified, we were this, but this doesn't look right. And so I got to that place where I'm like, yeah, I don't know what to do. And so I did stop going to that church, and I stopped going to church for a while. And I actually moved away from Philadelphia. And I needed that space because I got to the point where I felt like my family wasn't going to let me be anything else.
Mm.
I needed space. And I moved to Maryland. I think at this point I moved to Maryland. And I literally one day took all of my Bibles. I had like 5 Bibles because, I had the King James, I had the NIV, I had the Living Bible, which was the down, like nobody liked the Living Bible because that was a weak Bible, right? But I had all these Bibles. I had the Concordance, I had the Thompson Chain, I had the dictionaries, I had so much stuff. And I threw everything out, Tim.
Mm.
And what I said was, I I cannot connect to the God of my mother. Whatever God that my mom has been praying to, is it no, I can't do it. And my prayer was simply, I want to know you for myself. I'm going to toss out everything. I want to know you for myself.
Mm. That's a lot of bravery. That's awesome.
Well, you asked a question earlier about when did I feel like when that was, I remember this day, I can remember the window, I can remember where I was kneeling when I said it, I can remember the exact room. That was the first time ever where I felt saved. There wasn't a
Wow.
question in my mind. I never needed to go to anybody's altar ever again. There was no judgment, no question, no doubt, no fear, no worry. And I had never felt such a sense of peace.
Mm. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. I love how one of the things you're doing in your story there that I think I probably don't reflect on enough because it was very much a part of my story too, is just admitting that before all of the more concrete reasons to leave, like this and this and this, or like these are just obviously reasons to say this is a mythology based worldview.
Right.
Studying where the books came from, studying how different texts have been coming in and out of the canon and how they've been edited,
Mhm.
studying where the mythology was copied from in terms of the Greco-Roman mystery cults and the pantheons and the Homer's
Yeah.
Odyssey and all that. But before you get to those more concrete things, I think for a lot of us, it is that path where you're talking about where it's like, I'm not sure yet what to believe. I'm
Mhm.
not sure yet what all the holes are in this worldview, in this belief system, but I know simply experientially this isn't working. And I remember
Yeah.
one of the earliest things that I had was a little different but related. I had someone in my family who she listened to Christian radio nonstop. I mean
Mhm.
nonstop. It was on all day, apart from like Jeopardy maybe and the Wheel of Fortune at night, but like all day it was just church music. It was church
Mhm.
preachers. I mean, we're talking about 8 to 10 plus hours a day
Yeah.
of Christian radio in church, in choir, all the above. And when you spend time with her, she was one of the most selfish, nasty, cantankerous people I'd ever met. And I thought, this doesn't make sense. And I'd
Yeah.
see it in my own father. I had issues with my dad was, a Christian school teacher. He preached,
Mhm.
he was kind of an itinerant preacher. He was in the Bible all the time. And he was just horrible, nasty to my mom and to his
Mhm.
kids. And I don't say that vindictively, but just to give the context. He's passed now, but just to give the context of who he was. And as I saw this other person and I saw my dad, I thought, the
Mhm.
gospel doesn't seem to have much power. Like, where is the power? And of course, I'd see it from a distance, like, oh, the pastor seems to have the power. But then
Mhm.
one of the things that really was interesting to me was as I really got deep into prepping for pastoral ministry, I got this message from a couple different sources of you need to be mentored by someone in your church, a man. You need to be under the auspices and authority. And, yes, you need your little accountability groups with your peers, but you need an older, wiser man who's kind of tread the path already, who can teach you. And the big question was find a man in this church where you look at his worship, his walk with God and his family,
Mhm.
and you think, I want to be like that man.
Yeah.
And I was in a pretty big church and in a suburb of Philadelphia there. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't think there's anybody in this church that any man that I want to mimic.
Yeah.
Not a single one. Like, yeah, there's some little, that piece of how you talk, or that piece of
Mhm.
how you can just pull verses up out of the blue like crazy. They're just thousands of them in your head. I want to be like that. But like in terms of your personality and your family, I'd be like, you're too cold. You're too
Mhm.
distant. You seem weird. You literally just seem weird. Like, where is the attraction? Where are the men of God that you just want to be your leaders? And it really struck me in a pretty big church.
Yeah.
I couldn't find a single man I wanted to mentor me. And
Mhm.
those kind of things all added up to the point, and many, many, many others. It's like this early deconversion stage of like this, like something's wrong. I don't know quite what it is yet, but
Yeah.
something's wrong. And I'll say this last thing and then pass the ball back. When my last corporate job, one of the phrases they used to use a lot was, "We're going to move big rocks." Like we're going to find a big project that
Mhm.
everyone's like, "This is so broken. We got to fix this for our customers or whatever for the website. We got to fix this. This has to become smooth as can be, smooth as silk." And this process or whatever, this business aspect, we're going to move big rocks. And it hit me as we'd say that like as a mantra every meeting almost. Like
Mhm.
I don't really see God moving big rocks. I just
Mhm.
don't.
Yeah.
And that contrast eventually, like you can't deny it.
Yeah. I so resonate with that. And that was my grandmother, the evangelist, the holy, prayer warrior, speaking in tongues, anointing everybody with oil. Um, at one point, I kind of stood up to her. I felt like the black sheep in my family because at some point I started asking these questions and now like holding people accountable for stuff. And like, you know, she was very mean. Like I watched her physically beat one of my aunts in front of her kids. Like I watched that happen. And
Wow.
I'd have been like maybe like 12 or 13, maybe 12 or 13 at the time. So I wasn't like a kid, but I watched her do that. But with what one thing in particular with um, my mom didn't know who her dad was. But even worse, my grandmother for my mom's life had told her that her dad had passed away. Turned out he didn't pass away until my mom was in like, I think well into her like 50s or 60s. So all that time. But
Mm.
she was an evangelist, right? She was the prayer warrior. She was this godly woman that we had to revere. How do you lie like that to your child and keep that information from them and still and that was just like and that's like a tip of one of the things, right? But how can you do that? And I was so angry when I found that out because now I don't know who that part of my family is. No contact, no nothing, no nothing ever. How do you withhold information like that and still be this Christian revered person? And there were a whole lot of things like that. So yeah, I started putting like things together. Like it's not just me. You're not really working in any of these people's lives, you know? And the pastor, that last church that I went to, when he passed away, he was in an accident. And I went back for the funeral. And it was around that time that I learned that he had been sleeping with a lot of women in the church. So when you asked that question before about like sexual, I'm like, no, they don't leave the church, they stay in the church. But then it started to make sense to me as to why a lot of people in the church were doing the same kind of things. While we were all having some of those kind of struggles and issues, it's coming down from the head.
Mm.
right? We were all kind of caught up in that kind of stuff. So again, I'm seeing all of these people who proclaim the blood of Jesus and to be saved and how God transformed them and that God's given them power to heal and power to lead. And I'm watching them judge people and tell people that they can't do this and they shouldn't do this and they got to do this and they're falling short every single Sunday. And every single Sunday, you have no proof of that in your life because your decisions are made on, can I get away with it? Who's going to find out? Right? How, can I cover this up? That's your decision making. It's not, I'm not going to do this because it's not moral. Like so now you have no scruples, you have no morality, but you're a pastor or you're righteous or you're Christian and you can't judge other Christians. So so it really becomes this game. And as you sit back, if you step outside of it, you're like, there's very little power here, you know.
Yeah.
But when I made that decision, to throw everything away and I want to know you for myself, that was an official start. And I started becoming a pain in the ass probably to a lot of people in my family because I would ask those questions. And I think it's funny because I deconverted before my brother, right? And I remember like him and I would have these debates because I guess I approached from an experiential thing, but I also approached it from like common sense thing. Like I remember I told my sister, I said, we've been duped. I said, remember that story that they told us in the Old Testament about the Tower of Babel and how they didn't want, they said that all the people were coming together as one and they were going to build a tower so high that it would touch the heavens. And they didn't want that to be possible. So they confused all the languages. And I said, holy shit, that can't even happen. Right? Like humans cannot even breathe the air. So that's not even possible, but we were told that, and and so we were so indoctrinated that we never questioned the science of the fact that hey, probably not going to ever be able to build something that can reach the heavens. And I told my sister, I said, we've been duped, right? Like
Mm.
that doesn't even make sense, and we don't even question it. But more, I think, for me, was because of my background with abuse. I started becoming really sensitive to those stories in the Bible. Like one of the stories that really started to piss me off. Well, there were two stories that started to piss me off. And a third one that kind of sold it for me. But one of the first stories was with Lot. When and for that story of Lot, where the two angels come to visit him, and then the men outside of that town, the men that are in that town, they say, "Oh, give us those men because we want to have sex with them." And what does Lot do? Oh, you can't have them because they're angels, but you could have my virgin daughters. Now, mind you, Lot doesn't pray to God and ask for help. Wait a minute. Not only that, these are angels, but you want to offer your daughters as if the angels can't even call God and get help. Like, what's going on? Okay. And then there's a story of Tabitha in the with David's daughter. I think her name is Tabitha. It might be
Tamar. Tamar.
Tamar, thank you, Tamar, right. Where, the David's oldest son rapes his sister, and David doesn't do anything. David's lament is, "Oh, my poor son." And I had to read that a few times, be like, are you fucking kidding me? He defiled your daughter, and your lament is my poor son. And I believe it was Absalom, because it's been a while since I read this, but the brother is the one who got vengeance for his sister,
Yeah.
not David, not the worshiper who loves God and wants to dance before him. He was concerned about his son. The third thing that kind of really pushed me over was the story of Job. And I had so many conversations with my mother about this because my mother is very much, Christian. And no matter how many questions I would ask her about, can we take a look at the history of the Bible and how it got put together and who put the books in place and the timelines and the dates and, oh, but it's the word of God and it's infallible and you can't question the word of God. And, she gets that real stern, voice in her. And so I was talking to her about the story of Job. I said, so Mom, help me understand this. First of all, we don't get to see God because we're not holy, but the devil gets presence with God so that they can have an actual conversation, right? Because that's the premise of this. God and the devil just having a talk. Oh, you know, my servant Job, he worships me. He's oh, but if you take all the stuff away, he probably won't. So in this story, Job loses everything, his servants, property, his cattle. Guess what else Job also loses? All of his children. Because God's trying to prove a point to the devil. He's got to prove a point to the devil. Okay. And I said to my mom, I said, you know what? Job was married. So his wife lost all of her kids too. I don't understand a God who would do that. She had nothing to do with this. Nothing. And all of her kids. And my mom said this, and it crushed me. And it put up a wall between my mom and me for a long time. She said, but God gave them more kids. Fuck. So you mean to tell me if God takes away all of your kids but gives you more, it does it will magically make the fact that you lost those first kids go away. That was one of the most coldest and callous things that I'd ever tried to wrap my mind around.
Mm.
How he gave them more kids. Yeah, I think about, my the relationship that I have with my daughter, the way I love her. If she was to be removed, I can't imagine saying, "Oh, it's okay, I can have another kid," and now and I'm not going to feel the sting of that. That wife had nothing to do with that. But that's the kind of God that you want me to believe in, that he would entertain his enemy, somebody who he's got a whole book about how he's going to wipe the floor with him and condemn him to burning fires of hell forever. But in this instance, I'm going to have a conversation with you and I'm going to take everything away from this person and I'm not going to factor in this person's wife. And that's the kind of God that you think that I should bow to and worship. I can't. I can't do it. I
It's,
cannot do
I think that's such a critical piece of this, and for a lot of us, that really does become a major linchpin and a watershed moment of like this God is a psychopath. I remember in a related note this story of Abraham and Isaac, where God
it.
says, "I
Oh,
insist that you, I know that there's a lot of evidence that in the original story Abraham does slaughter Isaac, but in our story he is saved at the last minute, and the ram is caught in the thicket and is sacrificed instead." But there's just the fact that regardless of which story was the first one and the one we should be looking at, this God character says, I insist that you are willing to sacrifice your own child.
yeah.
And then you look too, even just not at the stories, but even just the commands where God says, if your daughter is going to get married and you find out she's not a virgin on her wedding night, stone her to death. If your kid is repeatedly rebellious and he just won't stop, stone him to death. And all this stuff, if you pick up sticks on the Sabbath, even, you get stoned to death. It's like
Yeah.
you realize that this God is so petty and so sick. And I
Mhm.
think it's just, this is a great point. I love that you're making it, that when you add in the gospel doesn't seem like it has power. It's not transforming lives. Things aren't jiving. God's not opening up doors. I remember too, like God's will doesn't seem to make sense here. He opens up doors and he slams them in your face. But then you bring in the psychopathic nature of God,
Yeah.
and it's like, okay, shit, I've got a problem. This
Oh, yeah.
doesn't work, and I wouldn't want this to work because he's an asshole. So what do
Mhm.
I do now? So I guess that's
Yeah.
my question for you. What do you do in that case where you're
Mhm.
that far removed from seeing the power, and at
Mhm.
that point from even wanting that God to be real?
I wanted it to be, I wanted to believe, so much. I can't, I went back through the stories, I went back and read things and I really kept thinking about the psychological terror of things. Like you mentioned a story about Abraham and first of all, the mental gymnastics you have to do, right? To make yourself say that God is telling you to kill your child. I would visualize Isaac, what the emotion, if this was true, if it was true, if we're going to say this is true, what the emotion would have to be to see your father standing over you with a knife as if to kill you. Like, how do you heal from that? Like what, like so the psychological and emotional abuse, right? And you know, saying like, I can't. And I tried, I tried. I remember one of the last things I did was I went to a Why Jesus conference. And this is money out of my own pocket. Nobody sent me there for work. I was living in Minnesota at the time, and I went to Chicago to a Why Jesus conference. Like I was that like I gotta find a way to make this work, Tim. Right. And I'm like, no. I went there, I bought books, and I was really, really, really trying. I couldn't do it. I couldn't keep it up. And then I started um going to other churches, other kinds of churches. I remember I went to a Zen Buddhist ceremony,
Wow.
and I was so scared that the thunder and lightning bolts were going to come. Like I literally thought, I was really scared that something was going to happen. Um, because it was like, oh, you're blasphemous and and it's good. And I remember going in, and the people were nice, and people were talking, and people were actually what I noticed was that it wasn't like a regular church where especially a lot of Black churches, you mentioned their clothing, where you come in and you're looking at people's clothing and you're looking at this and you're trying to assess people, like you do that when you've got all those things. There was none of that. There were people that were coming in and they were just sitting quietly, they were grounding themselves. And I remember finding a seat, and when I sat down, I had this impression that you're welcome. And it was that same lightness that I felt after I threw away all my stuff and said, I want to know you as myself. And I was like, I did not expect that. But it was a very welcoming experience. Um, and so I started, saying, I do not believe in Jesus at all anymore. And it's funny because I remember somebody sneezed, and I was like, I'm supposed to say, God bless you, but I don't believe that. Right. And then I started having the thing is like, well, who do you pray to? Who do you ask for help now? Because for so long, I'm gonna pray, oh God, help me, da da da. I don't believe in that. So now what do I do? Who do I call on when something's not right? Oh, I need help with such and such. I gotta find my car key. I think some people pray, God, help me find a parking space. But what do I do now? And I started really looking at spirituality different, and doing more journaling and doing more meditation and doing more reading. And I credit Neville Goddard and a lot of the new thought, because that was the first time that it gave me permission, as if I needed it though, but it gave me the opportunity to see the Bible not as literal, but as figurative, right? As
Mm.
story. And I said, oh, I can relate to it as story. I can't relate to it as something that's literal because it don't make sense, but I could see that story. And so what started to happen was I started to begin to start to realize, and this is something I had always thought. That verse in the Bible where they say that, there are going to be people that fall away from the gospel.
Right.
Every time I heard that, all the time when I was growing up in church, every time I heard that, there was something that said that's going to be me. No, anytime anybody said that, I was like, that's going to be me. But I would quench it down. I was, ah, no, 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 no. But I got to this point where I started, like I said, I could see it as a figurative story. And so I got to this place where I really started to realize that it was man doing his best to explain what he was experiencing with what he knew. Didn't have the words, didn't have the science, didn't have anything else. And when you start taking a look at where the stories come from, and that was another thing I had a question with my mom about, like, there are other stories. And actually, I remember asking my mom that even way before I started deconverting or deconstructing. Because I said to her one day, I said, Mom, but the Old Testament is only the history of the Jewish people. Where are all the other stories? Because there were other people on the planet. And if the Jewish people could write their story, well, where's their stories? Like this, it's biased, right? Like what happened to the other people's stories? And oh, it's not the word of God, and it's da, 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 da. And that never sat well with me that we were only getting one story. Because it's like it's biased, it's only those people. There have to be other people that are telling the same thing. So when I started realizing that, not only is it not all of their story, right? And it is in a way, if you realize just by human nature how things get, how the melting pot of cultures is, right? And how people are and how stories get passed down. I mean, listen, we have cell phones today where things are captured on screen and people will tell you the absolute opposite happened. They barely had writing utensils. So if you think that they had the ability to get stuff straight, come on, right? That's just not how history has ever worked because a lot of it has been oral history, and we've got to give it some latitude. We've got to give it some bias, and it's okay. It doesn't mean that it's like the people were really bad intention and they were trying to be misleading. We're human.
Mm,
And when I understood it as, you know what, they were doing the best they could. They were trying to put it together with what they knew, with what they had, and that's what they got.
yeah.
And
I
it's
think
okay.
when you mix in too the idea that they were trying to do the best they could, but that also, in a certain sense, at least at times in history, it was also very much imposed by the political power, by the church leaders. That you
Yeah.
realize that, in terms of the big world history, they were doing the best they could. But a lot of
Mhm.
this was just like, you believe this, or we're going to kill you, or we're not going to trade with you, or you're not going to get
Oh,
food, or
yeah.
whatever, and we're going to threaten you in some way. And
Hmm.
I love too how you're bringing in the other cultures of the world, because I thought that too. Like we when I grew up, we heard almost nothing about ancient China, for example, or ancient Japan. And there were people probably all over the world that you could pick thousands of places and think, what why didn't we know about the Aztecs and all that? And like,
Yeah.
you learn a little bit, but it's like it's almost like, well, that's all the devil's work. That's mythology. That's all pretend. But also some of it directly contradicts. Like if you're like, well, in the Bible it says there was a worldwide flood and it
Mhm.
probably occurred about this time. And then you're like, well, yeah, but the ancient people in Asia were living well before then and well after then, making records, and they were doing just fine. Like, we don't know what this flood is, but it didn't happen here. How can it be a
Exactly.
worldwide flood? Yeah, and you realize some of these religions were much, much, much older. When you look at like Hinduism,
Hmm.
and you're like, some of this stuff really was nonsensical for us to, but it's one of those things too where when you reflect on how you grew up and where you landed as a Christian, it's a really strong example of how indoctrination and sheltering and lack of information
Oh,
does such a
absolutely.
good job. You're
Oh,
just like, and it
absolutely.
mixed in with that arrogance of like, we're the best
Mhm. Yeah.
country, we're the best denomination, we're the best religion. And you're just like, wow, like how blessed am I and highly favored that I ended up in the right religion of all. Who'd have thought? How lucky.
Well, that connects, back to when we talk about the white Jesus thing. Because like one of the things that where the places where I am now, like I find myself very hungry to understand about African spirituality and religions
Yeah.
because it's been totally dismantled. Um, and when you have the whole white Jesus thing, right? You don't talk about the African gods and goddesses in that religion, but we know nothing, we know very little about that here in the US. Like you can, we try to go and learn and we try to see things, but it's all been colonized, right? It's all been filtered through this lens of a white Jesus. And it's interesting. I read something recently that said, and it really got me thinking. I listened to this video and it really got me thinking that. So here's what the expectation is from a Black perspective. You are now expecting me to trust my entire salvation in the same God that said it was okay for white masters to enslave me and to rape my sisters and my mothers and to beat us into, but do you want me to trust that same God for my salvation? And when you
Yeah.
think about how ludicrous that is, like the mental gymnastics and the cognitive dissonance that you have to use in order to make that work. This is the all-loving God This is the white Jesus who died for me. But he also said it was okay for these people to make me a slave. And he also told me to obey my master. Ah,
And for hundreds of years too, they would say, in many circles around the world, that black people were literally the descendants of Ham who were cursed. That the
yeah,
black skin was part of a curse. I remember
yeah.
hearing that a little bit at Bob Jones University. I think it was kind of dying
Uh-huh.
out, but like you're literally telling us, and if we're like now, healthy churches, oh no, that was bad people that made up that interpretation. Well, yeah, but for hundreds of years, white and black people were told that. Where
Mhm.
was God to show up and say, no, 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 no. You know what? I knew this was going to happen. I knew you would misinterpret that verse. So, I'm going to go back in time because I'm timeless, and I'm going to change that verse to make sure there's no doubt about it that you all don't think that black skin is a sign of cursing how I cursed Ham. No, no, he's like, I'm going to leave it in there, and you all
Yeah.
can just mess with your racism forever. Like, what?
Yeah.
Come on,
Well, even
God, you're
well,
better
let's
than
even
this.
yeah, well, let's even peel back that story because if I ever because I was just reading that not so long ago again. And who made the curse? I think it was Noah. I don't
Yeah,
think it was God. So when did Noah get the freaking power to turn people dark or to say that and now let's think about that even on an interested basis. So even if it didn't magically turn people's skin dark, who was Noah married to have a child of that complexion in the first place?
yeah,
So now it's clear that there had to be people of color, right?
yeah.
So there's all those like if you're telling me that this is true, and if it's got to be true, then it's got to make sense. They just didn't like show up one day and because Noah cursed them, now their skin turned dark.
Yeah, and I think Moses was married to an African woman too. So
African,
yeah, it's
absolutely, yeah, yeah. It says that where she was from was a place in Africa. So
yeah, it's horrific, and I think when you reflect on it too, eventually you realize that number one, of course, it just doesn't feel right, but number two, like as you get more specific, to me, one of the things that really hit hard was this sense of like, God, if you're out there, you did a pretty shitty job with your Bible. Like
oh
you
yeah,
didn't send the right messages. You left it wide open to a lot of bad interpretations. You didn't make it clear things like slavery, genocide, land theft, slavery, stoning, child brides, all this stuff, genital mutilation. Like you didn't really leave it clear. You left it open for a lot of bad people in power to say this is from the Lord, therefore it's true and it's good. But
yeah.
then you didn't even make it clear. Like, how do we know for sure this is your book? How do we know that's not man-made? And it seems like, from what I've seen of church history, that some books were in and then got pulled back out and other books weren't in and got put back in. Like this really looks like if,
Mhm.
if this is divine, it looks really man-made with a veneer of divinity. And
Mhm.
eventually it's like you realize this is a paper thin veneer.
Oh
And
yeah.
eventually it just fall. It's like gold leaf on some old furniture. It just falls off. And you're like, oh,
Oh yeah.
this is just gold leaf and there's nothing to it. And once you get to that point where you're like, this just doesn't feel that impressive. Like if this is my God,
Mhm.
if this I literally, I remember thinking to myself at some point, this is probably somewhat blasphemous at that time, but I remember thinking to myself, God, I feel like you could have done so much better. And I remember kind of thinking, praying that, like, God, why didn't you do better? You're like, if you can create galaxies and everything, you can create time and space and stars, the beauty of DNA and everything, and then you write this ancient book that doesn't make sense. Like the contrast between the beauty of the universe and the magic of it all, the math of it all, and the bizarreness and the just the
Mhm.
clunkiness of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. It's like you did a really shitty job. I'm sorry, but I can't be
Yeah.
very proud of what you did. And that's where
Oh
you
yeah.
go down that path for long, and you're like, all right, maybe what's more likely that he did a
Yeah.
shitty job, or that he's not there?
Well, yeah, that was a conversation I used to have with my brother because Lancaster Bible College, right? And we would talk about these scriptures, and then he would say, well, in the Greek and in the Hebrew, and I'm saying, are you kidding me? I said, what kind of sick joke is it that the God who wants to connect and communicate with people, but the only way for you to really know what he said is that now you have to learn Hebrew and Greek and whatever other language it was written in originally. You have to not only learn it, but you have to learn the context of it in order for you to understand him.
Yeah.
why would he do that? Why would he do that to all, all the people, or like, I think about this in terms a lot of like for Black folk, right? When, because I've heard people say, and this is some Christian crap that I've heard people say, well, if we had never been bought over as slaves, we would have never gotten the gospel. I've literally heard people say that. So I'm so thankful for that we went through that, because now we were able to become Christian and get the gospel of blah. First of all, that's a whole bunch of bullshit. But one of the things that I've said, so you mean to tell me when you take a look at the slave trade, the transatlantic crossing, how many people died? How many of those Africans, because and I have to be clear about this, they weren't slaves when they got on a boat. Before that, these were people that had families, that had lives, that had land, that had homes, that had culture. Those people were on a ship. How many of those were dumped overboard? Because there's a lot of that where they're cargo. They're dumped overboard, or they jumped, or they were killed. How many of them got the opportunity to hear the gospel? So you mean to tell me that you can be glad because now we got to hear the gospel because we're these descendants, but what about all of those people that didn't get that opportunity? That was part of God's plan too. Like, that's a shitty plan, especially if you are the God that has all the power. And not only that, but you know exactly what's going to happen. And then take it even back further. This is where I laugh, because I'm like, because this is the second time he's done this, right? Like, he created angels and they turned against him and wanted to leave. Right? So he said, okay, that didn't work. Now I'm going to create humans with less power. Guess what? They didn't obey him and they turned against him too. So you can't tell me that he's a perfect God when he failed with the angels, turned around and did it again. And then even after he made us, he said, oh, I can't stand them. I'm going to kill them all with a flood. 3 times, dude. 3 times. And you still haven't gotten it right.
And even with the gospel, Jesus died. His death is so powerful, and yet he says almost everyone ends up on the path to destruction. The path to life is very narrow. So even the beauty that's woven up in the gospel story, it ends up affecting positively almost nobody, and almost everybody ends up still in hell. So even when he comes up with a solution, it doesn't help many people.
Yeah, yeah. And why make it that way? Like one of the conversations that I have with a lot of people is about free will. Oh, there's evil in the world because of free will. Well, okay, we didn't create free will. The only reason we even would have a concept of free will is because the person who created us had to give it to us, if that's what you believe. So you mean to tell me that my free will trumps God? I'm praying for somebody to stop. And I go to the abuse thing again because that's my story. And I know this, but I also know that this is very prevalent. So a child is being abused and they're praying to God, God, please stop. Please, please don't let my dad come home and hit my mom again. Please, please, please. And the all powerful, all loving, all knowing, gentle God who loves us unconditionally says, I would, but he got free will. I would intervene. I would stop it. But you know what? Free will, free will. So free will now trumps God.
Mm.
How does that ever make sense? He's all
Especially when you
powerful.
especially when you bring in child sexual abuse. You're like,
Oh,
God could
absolutely.
stop it, but he's not just aware of it, he can see it. He's watching sexual abuse happen to a child, and he won't stop that. Are
But
you
wait a
kidding me?
minute, it gets even worse, Tim. You created the person who was going to have that trait or have that tendency or have that desire.
Yeah,
You created it. Oh, God doesn't create evil. It says in that book. It says in a book that he created evil.
yeah.
He can't create everything and then say, I don't create evil. You either created everything or you didn't. So which one is it? Because if you didn't create evil, then that means evil is something over you. But if you did create everything, then guess what? You created good and evil. And I honestly believe that, we do have that duality within us, right? There is no black or white. Like it's all who we are. And that's really helped me to have more compassion for people, right? Like there's some shitty people in this world. There's some really, really bad and messed up people in this place. There are also people that have the propensity to do amazing good. If you want more of that, and we want to see more of that, but it is not this. all evil, all good, because we all have that level of, we all have that opportunity to have that duality exist inside of us. We just have to choose to feed which one we want to see more of. And that's not, and I don't even know how much of that is free will if you get into the science of it, because I follow Neil deGrasse Tyson, and what he has a really fascinating explanation about, is it really free will when you talk about collapsing timelines and all that, kind of gets really technical, and that comes up, which is fascinating. But what I am excited about is that we don't have to know the answer, and we get to explore, and we get to journey, and we get to question, and we get to have these dialogues, and we get to grow. And I think I'm much more excited about that part of the human experience than a human experience that says, well, you got to believe this, and you got to believe the way we say, and you got to do what we tell you to do, or else you're not going to be, or you're going to be excommunicated, or you're not going to be connected to God. Because I'm like, if God, and that you talked about, this the story, like, how he just gave us a book and that was it. And one of my recent questions has been, so you mean to tell me that this Jesus dude was here for 30 plus years and not once did it ever occur to him to pick up something and write his own story? Really? Like, was he illiterate? Like, I mean, he was here for 30 plus years, and knowing how men's mind work, men's minds are evil, and knowing that, it never ever crossed your mind. You never had the consideration that you might want to write your story yourself so that there would be some credulity, some credence to it, right? So that we had just, it would be credible. You might want to do that to help us out.
Yeah. And even if he had, it would have been in Aramaic, arguably. And it's now a dead language. So even if he had done it, it'd be a dead language by now. And
Yeah.
especially when you think about he knew the technology that would come, well, why not just find some way to make human history evolve technologically a little bit earlier? So by the time you want to come, there's television cameras already and people are more literate, and you can just prove it. Like, look, I can get your cameras out. I will be dead in a day, and
Yeah.
3 days later I will be alive, and you will be able to have the proof. And there's so
Yeah.
many logical fallacies to this thing. But can I ask, when you're looking at that,
Yeah.
at what point do you just say to yourself, all right, I'm going to stop trying to make this fit? I'm just like, oh, this is just mythology. There's nothing there.
Yeah, it was when I came back from that Why Jesus event, and then I started listening to Neville Goddard and some new thought, about other ways to look at it. Because I think that was my linchpin, right? It was like, well, so no, what do I do with the Bible? Like, because it was such an ingrained part of me, right? That, well, how does this fit? And I could not find a way to make it fit. And so the minute I had the ability to see that maybe it is just a figurative story and there's some lesson in that, it changed everything. Like, oh, well, now it makes perfect sense. Because what else was happening was that if I'm saying all these prayers, now and God's not answering my prayer, now I'm trying to justify and rationalize why God isn't answering my prayer, right? So did I sin? Am I just asking for the wrong thing? Or, as we're taught, lean not to your own understanding, which is horrible to tell people. Don't trust what you think. Don't trust what you know. Just lean on God's ways are higher than your ways, right? Okay, so I must be asking for the wrong thing. Or maybe I did something wrong and I'm being punished. Or maybe my favorite one is he could just be trying to test you, to test your faith. You won't know, or you won't know which one it is. You just have to kind of figure it out. And I was trying to rationalize and justify everything through those three lenses. But then when it says, oh, it's not that he's ignoring you or he's punishing you or he's testing you, he's just not real. Like, oh, that explains it. It's not real. And if he's not real, then of course he wouldn't answer. If he's not real, of course he wouldn't let priest after organization continue to abuse children and mistreat people. If he's not real, of course he can't intervene and stop a war and stop a Holocaust because he's not real. Oh, thank God. Because if he was real, trying to justify why he doesn't show up, trying to justify why he created and designed it and knew exactly what was going to happen and sat back with some popcorn and wine and watched all unfold like a reality TV show. That's so hard to explain. It's so hard to try to hold in your body. It's so hard to try to make sense of. So after that why God, why Jesus conference, and starting to realize that you don't have to take it literal. And if that's not literal, then that isn't real. That made everything so much easier. Oh, it's I don't have to justify this. I don't have to try to explain, why so and so died, why two people prayed for, cancer to be healed and one person got healed and the other person didn't. I have to try to explain that now, you know? But that's what we put ourselves through.
Once you were at that point where you realized, like, wow, it just makes more sense. He's just not there. This is mythology. Did you feel heartbroken over the idea that you might not go somewhere when you die? Or was it more just like total relief? Like, how did you relate to the afterlife?
I didn't feel heartbroken. I didn't feel because it wasn't like it wasn't like, oh, heaven is a wonderful place. And I'm laughing because that's a song. Heaven is a wonderful place. Like we've, been singing that song since I was little. It never seemed like it was that amazing to me. It was like, oh, I can't wait to go to heaven. I was like, yeah, okay. Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it was the antithesis of hell, right? So I don't want to go to that place. So I guess, I get to go to the other place, but it wasn't like, oh my gosh, I can't wait to get to heaven and be with Jesus and hear the angels sing. I was like, who wants to do that? Like that doesn't, so that never fazed me.
Hmm.
Um,
I'll
you
admit,
know,
I did want to do that. I really, 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 really did. But I digress. Go on.
well, yeah, for a minute it was this thing about hell, and people say that all the time. Well, what if hell is real? I'm like, okay, I guess we'll have to find out. But I'm not willing to pin my tail on that donkey. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I'm not willing to, to because none of this other stuff makes sense. And I'm like, well, show me the proof. God, if you love us and you are unconditionally wanting to show us love and save us, then save us. If it's a gift of salvation, I don't have to do anything. You're giving it to everybody. I mean, because now, because I wrote this recently. So, in the way most Christians frame it, God's unconditional love is conditional. Because what you're telling me is that the only way for me to get this is if I believe. But if you say it's unconditional, I don't have to do anything. He died on the cross for everybody. So whether I claim it and believe it or not, it should be free. Why are you giving me a condition on your unconditional love and your gift?
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like some people will try to go to a universal salvation, the whole love wins stuff with Rob Bell. But yeah, just the whole thing it makes more sense to me to say it's this whole God character just looks made up. It just simply looks like people made it up. And I think too, when you realize, when you step back from all these questions that are directly kind of coming out of the God of the Bible concept, the
Mhm.
Yahweh character and Jesus, you realize we're already, even before we answer the question of is that the right God and does he make sense, we're just in this, we're implying that the questions have to go down the specific track of is
Yeah.
Yahweh God or isn't he? It's like, well, how do we know there's not 10 gods or 20 gods? How do we know that God isn't a female? How do we know that that this isn't all simulation? How
Mhm.
do we know? I remember one person asked a very astute question. How do we know that God, meaning I should say Yahweh, how do we know that Yahweh isn't actually the devil and the devil isn't the good guy? Because Yahweh kills a lot more people than the devil does. How do we know that also this whole thing isn't a test from some other God that's not named to simply say, are you mature enough as a species to admit that I'm going to give you a test like Job. I'm going to give you a test, but the test is not, will you praise me? The question is, will you see through this bullshit worldview and say, there's
Mhm.
got to be more than this? This doesn't make sense. Are you smart
Exactly.
enough? It's all the Christian. I mean, the Christians kind of try to limit you to it's either Yahweh or it's nihilism. It's Yahweh or there's no meaning to anything. It's Yahweh or it's chaos. It's like, no, there's a lot more. And even there's the more fun thoughts of like, what if God as a concept is actually just a super advanced alien species? We don't
Mhm.
know. We have no
Yeah,
idea. And what if they're now with more, quantum physics and all that coming out? What if we're in a multiverse? And what does that imply? Who knows?
exactly. Yeah.
But when you, I feel like I could ask you a bunch of questions about that, but just for the sake of moving it forward or in time, what
Yeah.
was the response when you first became vocal? Not just asking questions, good questions of your family and loved ones, but of saying, like how did you get the bravery to first say I'm actually completely out? Like, You can talk all you want,
Yeah.
but I don't even think that's real. I'm not
Yeah.
I'm not saying I want to sin or be, do my own thing.
Mhm.
I'm saying your God isn't there.
Yeah.
What was that like first speaking up about it?
I don't even know if I ever really had a flat conversation that said I'm this or I'm that. I would just always ask questions. And I would say, well, that doesn't make sense, or and like, and we had a lot of conversations with my brother, right? Like, going home and visiting family, because I stopped talking to my mom about it at some point because no, like there's nothing here. I'm not going to get through to you. I don't want to have an argument with you. And we really can't have a good conversation about it because you're not looking into anything enough. You're just going by what you believe. But I would always have those conversations with my brother. So he kind of knew where I stood in
Was
terms
he
of
in the ministry still with rap music and all that?
he was. And yeah, he was for a while and I remember there have been times when I wanted to post something on social media about what I was coming to believe about what I was stepping away from. But I remember at some points, and I didn't know that he was deconverting. I didn't know that he was going through that whole thing. But I remember not wanting to post something because I'm like, well, they're going to see that I'm his sister and they're going to think that, and I don't want to cause any blemish on him. So I'm going to be quiet about this. But then I started speaking up more about it. And it's so funny because now I've become very vocal about it. And people are like, well, you just started this journey. I said, no, this has been a 20-year journey, because it happened. My daughter's 22, and I threw away the Bibles before my daughter was born. Right. And I didn't share that
Hmm.
story because that was one of the other reasons the reason why I stopped going to churches at all was because of her. Was because because I did feel a little guilty at some point because I'm like, I'm a mom. I'm supposed to expose my kid to God, and I don't want her to like say, well, mom, you never taught me about God, so so I started trying to find churches, right, where I could take her so she could be exposed to it. And I found this one church, and I remember I'd taken her there, and they were doing stuff in the community, and they had like children's stuff, and it seemed like a great place. And I went to their Sunday worship, and about 40 minutes into the Sunday worship, the people started running around and screaming and speaking in tongues, and I felt her on my leg, and I looked down, and she's looking up at me, and she was scared. And I remember picking her up, and I was, and that was the last time I ever went into a church for a church service because I was very aware at that moment. I said, I was raised in such a fear of God. I did not want my daughter to have that relationships with, that I didn't want her to have a fear-based relationship with God. However she came to it, I did not want her to have that experience. And I said, I'm never going back. And I never went back to another Sunday service after that. And I was just writing about that because because of the time, of that we were in, it was like near Mother's Day or something like that. And when I told her this, she said, thank you. And oh, you talk about something that made my heart feel good because she was thankful that I had not put that on her. And so that was, yeah, but that was another one of those milestone moments, for me. So never had the big thing about
Awesome.
having had the fear about hell for just like a little bit, but like I said, there's so much more that we get to explore. It's so much more exciting. And I had another experience too. Because I'm very spiritual now. Like that's where I am. Like my brother is totally like he doesn't think there's anything, right? And I'm in this place where I think there's something divine. I don't know if we have the words for it. I don't even know if we have all the understanding of it. I don't think we do, but I do think that there's something that's divine. And I remember one day I was doing some journaling or meditation, and what I heard, and it's gonna sound weird because it's not like this big booming voice out of the sky, but I still internally heard it, right? And it said, "What if we never saw you as anything but whole?" And oh man, just the sense of warmth and sense of that sense of um peace. There was just such a sense, such an energy to that. And I remember crying because I thought about all the women, all we hear we're born in sin, we're not worthy, you're not holy, you're not righteous, your righteousness is filthy rags. We're growing up with that. And I just thought about of all the women, what if we were taught that approach from the beginning? that whatever created us has never seen us as anything other than whole. How would we show? Because it's very, when you think about how disconcerting it is to be raised in a place that teaches you that the person or the deity that created you sees you as a sinner and sees you as such a sinner that he had to kill his own son to restore a right relationship with you. You were that bad. You're so evil and so unholy that you can't even see his glory. Right? That's what we're taught. That's we live with that. If you ascribe to Christianity, that's how you live. So just imagine if your whole persona, your whole being is transformed by understanding that whatever created you has never seen you as anything other than whole. What would that do for your esteem? What would that do for your sense of self? Right? Just and that blew me away.
Wow. What a beautiful gift to give to the next generation too. Just blows my mind. I'm overwhelmed with that, the emotions of that too, because it's very relevant for my kids who are still young, how
Mhm.
much I want to give that message to them and undo the damage and just give them so much better than we were given. It's beautiful.
Yeah,
In terms of you mentioned Brady there. I would love to hear if you're okay, kind of bringing us towards a close.
yeah,
How did that, how did those conversations evolve when you found out he was deconverting? I know I've heard a little bit of this, I think in
yeah.
pieces, but what was it like when he was like, hey, it's just, let's talk?
Well, it was exciting, number one. But so my brother is he's super smart, number one. And so I knew that he was working on this book because we would talk a little bit about some of the stuff that he was working on, and he would share with me these books that he found, and I would add them to my reading list. So that became really, really fun. But it was interesting for him to tell me, for me to learn that there are times when he was just asking me questions, and he wasn't asking questions as opposed to like to try to win me over. He was asking questions because he wanted the debate. He wanted to play devil's advocate. He wanted to explore all the different sides of things. And I had no idea. So I'm thinking like we're having this conversation because he's trying to win me over to this Christian way of thinking and da 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 da. And it was really him, you know, engaging in conversation because of the research that he was doing, because he wanted to play all sides of things. So that was kind of fun to discover, in our conversations, because he had been going through that deconversion for about 4 or 5 years, right? And I had no idea. And it was interesting because I remember feeling bad sometimes because, oh man, I'm trying to lead him away, and like I'm feeling that. But the reality of it was, I have to be who I was. And one of the things that I'm thankful about is that I had the opportunity to be 100% of who I was with my brother, with all of my questions, with all of my doubts. Like, I don't have all the answers to any of this stuff. But I am enjoying figuring it out. I am enjoying asking the questions and finding out new books and new spiritual practices. I'm enjoying that part of life right now. And being able to share that with my brother has really strengthened our connection and our relationship, because I'm able to be all of who I am. I don't have to censor myself, with him. I mean, I censor myself with some of my other family because sometimes the things they talk about when it comes to Christianity, they're going to give you a Bible verse, and it's exhausting. But I love being able to have those conversations. So it was really exciting as he was, putting his book together, and I got to read it ahead of time. And I always knew he was smart. And I laugh because when he was a rapper, I have never heard anybody include Maslow's hierarchy in their rap. Like, he literally has a line, like has a bar in his rap about Maslow's hierarchy. I'm like, dude, you're way smarter than what you're trying to let people know you are. And so I tell him all the time, I knew back then how super smart you were, but it's just amazing to see like the work that he does and the things that he puts in. Like, he really did his due diligence with that. As I think it's funny because he comes from a very like, you know, scientific and research kind of side. And I've got a little bit of that too because I'm a nerd and a book lover, but I come from a heavier experiential side. When you look at the emotion, when you look at the theory or the ideology or the belief system that they're asking you to hold on to maintain that God is who he says he is, or I call him this Bible God is who he says he is, the experiences prove different, right? It's not adding up.
Yeah, I love that. And just Brady, I've had many interactions with him at this point. He is just an absolute gem of a person. He's got a heart of gold, and
Yeah.
he's doing so much good. And I love that you're all like the tag team, dynamic tag team here. But on the note of tag team and doing some smackdowns for the opposing team. When you look at your life now, and
Mhm.
you've obviously, like you said, you're well past some of this. You've regrounded yourself. You're healed, I'm sure, on some of it, even though some of it, it's a lifelong process. But you've moved past some of the harder parts of it. You've really taken back your power, and that really shines through in your story and just the way you present yourself. You have a lot of power. You have your voice. What do you feel like as you look forward to, let's just say, the next 5 to 10 years? What do you feel like is on your heart in terms of projects or aspirations to either do or be involved in, partner with people, whatever, something that's going to help other people who are maybe at the hardest parts of it to move
Yeah.
forward? Like what's your passion? What's on your heart these days?
Well, that's where the liberation coaching comes in. I spent the last 7 years as an entrepreneur building a marketing agency, and got to be pretty successful. That hit multiple six figures, in a marketing agency. And I've gotten to this point where I'm like, I don't want my legacy, my next, the work of my life to be that Tai was a marketer. And so I'm going back into writing and going back into speaking. Like a couple of the topics that I'm working on is this whole idea of the myth of purpose. I really, especially for a lot of women, we are always taught to tie our purpose to other people. And it's one of the reasons why I think we've seen a lot of pastors, people who may have had really good intentions in the beginning, fall because their myth has always been outside of themselves. So my myth is to lead people to God. My myth is to save people. My myth is my purpose, not my myth. My purpose is to save people. My purpose is to this. My purpose is to help people and lead people, but they never get to do the work of healing themselves. And so because they never heal themselves, eventually their ego, their unhealed stuff, the things that they haven't worked on takes over and it ruins any of the things that they've done. But if we change that and our purpose is not always attached directly to other people, if our purpose becomes to become the best version of ourselves, then everybody wins. Right. And so I'm going to talk about that more. I want to talk about the idea of sacred shackles. Right. Like the Bible was supposed to be a promise of liberation, but it's shackled us. It shackled us to a lot of things that are keeping us not being able to heal, not being able to grow, not being able to solve the problems that humanity faces because we're so reliant and codependent on a God who has not shown up, right? So those are the things that I'm looking to speak to, writing more, sharing the story and really creating a community for women and particularly Black women. And then we talked about the segregation and those kind of things, but what I'm understanding and realizing is that there's certain things, that we can't always say comfortably, especially when people are kind of making this transition and we want to talk about decolonizing religion. And, if we're in a space where there are people that are not people of color, and now we're trying to censor ourselves, or and as much as we say we don't do it, but we might not want to be 100% as honest and say what we want because we don't want to hurt somebody else's feelings. We don't want to say something. So we need a separate space where we get to have these conversations without that, or what we call without it being centered on a white experience, right? When do we get to take a look at relate at religion and spirituality and deities, ritualization and all those kind of things from a black centered experience, an African centered experience? I want to create a space for us to do more of that. I was laughing the other day at how there's sites like Gaia, where you can go and you can find about all the Middle Eastern religions and all that kind of stuff. I'm sad some days and also kind of angry about it that there's no place I can go and find 25 videos about the different deities of West Africa or Egypt or North Africa. I can't go and get a video series about that. It doesn't exist. As if to say, oh, nobody needs to know that.
Yeah,
No, we need 90 million sites about, yoga and, Buddhism. Not to say that those things aren't relevant and valuable, but the spirituality and religious practices that were in Central America and that were in Africa are just as valuable as well, but we don't have a
yeah.
place for them.
Hmm. What a great point. I love it. And yeah, you realize that just like we would have said, perhaps if you're for those who are deconverting but open to it, to say, I'm moving away from this religion of Christianity as my worldview, but I can still take a few good points from it. We can
Hmm.
do the same thing with all these other religions and say, there was the storm god of this place, there was a lightning god of that place, a mountain god of this place. And it's like, yeah, I think they're all mythology too, but there may have been some interesting parts of their philosophy, just like we might go to Plato or Socrates or something and say, whatever we think they wrote from what's left behind, we don't have to see the world like them, but we can glean some wisdom. We can glean wisdom from all these different worldviews, and especially for those who are more interested in the spirituality side. But like you talked
Hmm.
about, again, I'm probably more. I've landed a little bit more like Brady in the sense I'm more of a materialist and a nihilist. But like if spirituality of some level, and some level is really a big focus for people as they deconvert, it'd be nice to have all the information. Like just put it out there, and let's have it as real smorgasbord, and I'll pick the parts that make sense for my life. But good.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it so much. Well, in terms of your story, I know we've gone on for a while, and I just want to say thank you so much. This has been so cool to finally get to know you. This has been on my radar for quite a while, and
Mhm.
I think we crossed paths a while ago a little bit, and just never got a chance to move forward with the interview. But I'm so glad it finally did sync up because I've heard great things about you, of course, from Brady. He sings your praises every which way, and I've heard other good things about you from other sources. But I'm so glad I finally got to kind of hear it right from you, and so glad that you got a chance to share it on this podcast too. But before we wrap up, was there anything else about your story or just anything on your heart that you wanted to add, and then we'll wrap up?
Yeah, one of the things that the project that I'm working on is something called Catfish by God. I forgot to mention that. And that's something that
Nice title.
it's a new Facebook page, but it describes my, experience of God saying, I'll love you unconditionally, but if you ever leave me, I'll send you to hell. Right. It's like the worst relationship ever. And so I'm on a mission to help more women tell their stories about being catfished by what we've been told God is, but what it really is underneath. And so that's a fun project. It's got some humor to it. It's got some depth to it. And so if people are looking to follow me on like Facebook or look there, I would take a look at Catfish by God.
Awesome, awesome. I'll make sure I have the link for that too beneath this video. And
Mhm.
that's a great point too. I always chuckle about how the things that the Yahweh character says, like if a for example a husband ever said them to his wife, like even just if if you're getting married, like, hey, sweetie, I really, really, really want to marry you, and I'll take such good care of you and love you so much, and it'll be so sweet. We'll make such good memories. But by the way, if you say no to this proposal, I will beat the shit out of you. Like, okay,
And I'll do it
great,
forever.
forever, and you'll deserve it. It'll be your fault. Uh, Crazy. It's amazing what we used to believe, and I'm so glad. Of course, the big point is always so glad you're free, and of course, that your story can be a really good example to other people who are getting through it. And I just want to say too, to wrap up, I love your joy. You have so much joy and fervor. It just exudes from you, and I think that's one of the biggest things that I've come to appreciate about this journey is that we were always taught, it's the joy of the Lord, the joy of the Bible, the joy of Christianity, the joy of the afterlife that's waiting for you, and then just the Holy Spirit comes in, and this fruit of the Spirit is joy and so forth. And to realize there is so much joy and peace on the other side of this, because you realize, of course, first and foremost, you were duped, you were in a prison for your mind, and now you're free.
Mhm.
What an awesome thing is that? But also the idea that you finally get to have hopefully some time to get to know yourself for real, to heal,
Yeah.
and to be regrounded, and then to hopefully pass it on and leave this place better than we found it. There's a lot of joy and peace in that, and also just the getting rid of the whole concept of like he's looking in your head and judging you all the time. There is so much peace and joy, and of course the cognitive dissonance that we talked about extensively, where it's like you don't have to try to make these pieces fit anymore. They've never fit, and you can just let it go. They're not going to fit. They're just not. And that there's a lot of peace from that. It's so much joy. And when you said that, and then I said we're going to wrap up. I'll keep this short. But when you talked about that time when you remembered the window and everything, where you just were like throwing out your Bibles, it really resonated with me because I remember the day I deconverted. It
Mm.
was, I don't remember the exact date. I should have written it down. It was about somewhere around the end of September, early October of 2019. But I remember the hour, like that hour that it happened. It was a Saturday morning, and I remember just thinking, "This is awesome!" Like I could have gone to my deathbed thinking this was real, and likely if I've got some years left, I've actually got some time to just truly live. And I was immediately, my immediate like grief was not over what I had lost, even though I
Mm.
certainly grieve the afterlife loss, but I grieved the fact that I instantly connected the dots of thinking the people around me are not going to escape. A lot of them will escape later. A lot of them will never escape.
Yeah.
And that horrified me. And I was like, but you, Tim, you won the lottery. You did escape. And that's that's a reason to rejoice. That's a reason to be glad. And I love the peace and the joy that comes. So thank you for being a great example of that.
Thank you. And thank you for giving people the opportunity to tell these stories. Now we get to become part of the oral history for the next generation, telling a different story, giving people a different lens to filter things through as they are embarking on their own journey of self-discovery. So I'm so appreciative of you doing this and giving people a space to tell their story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And likewise for what you're doing. Well, I'll just wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with Tai Goodwin. Tai, thank you again so much. It's been so good to hear your story today. I'm so glad you're one of us. You're on the team that's making such a big difference. We're in the change management team, and we're making a big wave, tsunamis in this world. But thank you so much for your time today. It's great to get to know you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. It has been my absolute pleasure. One of the funnest conversations that I've had.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thank you so much again. Have a wonderful day.